Yes, namaste. Welcome, everyone. This week's webinar is Race and Modern Hinduism. I'm Ankur Patel, Director of Advancement for Hindu University of America. We have President of HUA, Sri Kalyan Vishwanathan, on us. We'll have Dr. Joydeep Bakshi and Dr. Vishwa Adluri join us shortly. Obviously, race is at the foreground of so much of our conversation today, and the news media portrays it in such a in a way that needs HUA's attention. And that's why we're having this webinar, to bring together some powerful minds who can bring some needed perspectives on Hinduism, on race, on the interactions, and how do we approach this. Kalyanji, maybe I could just hand it off to you so you can give this webinar some context, and I'll check in with Joydeepji and get him on.
Okay, hello, namaste everybody, and good morning. So we're waiting for Dr. Joydeep Bakshi and Dr. Vishwa Adluri to both join. Joydeep Bakshi is in Germany, in Berlin, and he will be joining from there. There he is. And Dr. Vishwa Adluri is in New Jersey, and he'll be joining from there as well. Now, I want to begin the webinar today with a couple of comments. The first one is, see, race essentially is a conversation about the inherent, indisputable, uncontestable superiority of one race of people over another race of people. Okay, so now this conversation is got a tremendous power, a tremendous presence. It's got a tremendous impact, and it's everywhere. I mean, as you can see in America, it is everywhere. It is in the conversation. It is, everything can be framed in a race-based narrative, a race-based frame of reference, if you will, right? Now, the question is that we are going to talk about today is, how did it all begin? When did it start? And how did it come about? And what was the theorizing that went on in the creation of race theory, and how systematic it was, that then seeded into the popular conversation, such a vast network of ideas and thoughts that are sustaining after all these years. I also want to show a quotation and a picture. So here is a picture of a scholar by the name Heinrich von Steitenkorn, clearly a German name, receiving a great award from the President of India, Dr. Pranab Mukherjee, who passed away recently. So here is a quotation from him. I'll just read it once. The analytic thinking of Western interpreters who are schooled in historical philological methods stands in contrast to the traditional Indian commentators who not only harmonized and freely downplayed all breaks in the text, which apparently he can see clearly, i.e. the Gita, the Bhagavad-Gita, but above all, sought to read.
I cannot see the picture or the quote. It's not being shared.
It's
Sorry
not being
about
shared. Okay, sorry. Okay, let me put the. Oh, sorry. Thanks for interrupting. Here it is. So the quote once again from the top: the analytic thinking of Western interpreters who were schooled in historical philological methods stands in contrast to the traditional Indian commentators who not only harmonized and freely downplayed all breaks in the text, i.e. the Bhagavad-Gita, but above all sought to read their own philosophical theological concepts out of individual textual passages in order to secure Krishna's divine authority for them. A spectrum that has been further expanded since the beginning of India's independence movement by the politically motivated interpretations of modernity. And there is, you might ask, what is so racist about this quotation? Or where does race theory come into play in understanding this quotation? For that, I'll turn the webinar over to Dr. Joydeep Bagchi and Dr. Vishwa Adluri. Ankur, do you want to provide a short introduction to Dr. Joydeep Bagchi?
Sure, yes. Sorry for not doing that a little bit earlier, but Dr. Joydeep Bakshi is a core doctoral faculty member at HUA. He's a visiting professor, as Kalyanji mentioned, in Berlin, Germany. He's got a PhD in philosophy from the New School for Social Research in New York. And his areas of expertise are 20th century continental philosophy, German Romanticism, Nietzsche philology, and the Western reception of Indian thought. And that's really what we're getting into, right? The Western reception of Indian thought. We also have Dr. Vishwa Adluri. I'll just give a brief one so we can get into it. And Dr. Vishwa Adluri is also a core doctoral faculty here at Hindu University of America. We're putting together intellectual heavyweights to get into this. These are two of our stars right here. And he's got three, Dr. Vishwa Adluri's got 3 doctorate degrees, and his work is kind of focused on the reception of ancient Greek and Indian thought in modernity. And Professor Adluri focuses and guides its HUA's texts and traditions concentration. So without too much more introduction, I think we want to get into the conversation, and I'll hand it over. You're on mute, sir.
Thank you, Ankur, for that generous introduction, and Kalyan for inviting us and making, first of all, I want to thank Kalyan for making Hindu University possible. He's one of the undying supporters of this. And Dr. Bagchi will be teaching a course on this, so he will be doing most of the talking. If anyone has questions, you may address it to both of us, or him or myself. And also feel free to ask questions in chat. If you need clarifications, I'm here. I will type up responses to you. Dr. Bagchi, continue.
Thank you. So first, I want to say namaskar to all of you. Thank you for attending. It's an honor for me that there are about 95 people, or 102 now, so we're steadily climbing, that have shown up to listen to me. I am, as you've heard, a core doctoral faculty member at HUA, but I am first and foremost Vishwa Adluri's student. And that is the honor, the title that I wish to take to my grave, that I have followed Vishwa all my life, ever since I got to know him, and he has been the philosopher I sought. So everything I've done has been a justification and a defense of his philosophical vision of humanity. And those are big words, but today we are talking about big topics. So having got my pranams to the gurus and the lineage of gurus out of the way, let me now begin with the slideshow and a little bit of biography and what drew me to the Hindu University of America. Like many of you, this is a new institution for me. It's an institution that was recently refounded. As you can see on Ankur Patel's screen, 1993 is when it was first founded. But a few years back, it was revived, and I was drawn to the university by its promise of making a new beginning in the humanities. And that beginning, although it is new, it answers to what has happened as far as I know and I see it in the last 200 years in Western humanities and Western history, ending with the collapse of the humanities and the collapse of a common humanity, which we saw most dramatically in the Holocaust. This is for someone who comes from the new school and was trained by Vishwa and learned from Rainer Schurman and Arendt. This is sort of the foundational event from which we begin. How do we study text now? How do we read text now? Knowing that 200 years of the university has led us to this crisis. So that's where I'm beginning. So let me, with that, start the slideshow. And I will first start it and then I will go share it, or vice versa. I don't know which I'm doing. So let me do screen share. I would request that if you have questions, you type them up for yourself and keep them for the end and ask me directly, because when it pops up in the window, it distracts my line of thinking, and then I have to partly think of a response to you before I lose it. So let's have questions at the end. Okay, is everyone able to see this? Yes? Okay, wonderful. One or two of you can unmute, and so I can have a conversational partner. It can be Kalyan, it can be Vishwa, it can be one of the participants if that's possible. So let's start with the slideshow. Why this specific attraction to HUA? Why are all of you gathered today at HUA? Like you, when I began my career in Western philosophy in the university, I felt that academia was a neutral place. Look, knowledge is universal. Everyone can have an access to knowledge, everyone can contribute, and science is also universal. Very soon it became clear that academia is a system of privilege, right? So it actually, very few people there are actually motivated by desire to share and foster knowledge. It is simply a kind of priesthood or a class system which preserves its own self. So there's a kind of guild identity in academia. Now you will also notice that I've put the words white in parentheses. And the reason for that is it's not as straightforward as it's a system of white privilege, because even there you have to distinguish. Jews were, for example, for 200 years treated horrifically at the university. Although they are European white, even at German universities, they were marked for their clothes, they were marked for the way they spoke, they were considered backwards, they were forced to convert, they were forced to adapt or adopt attitudes of derision towards fellow Jews, not be seen with other Jews. So it's not as straightforward as saying it's a system of white privilege. Vice versa, in the fields that I currently have been looking at, Indology and South Asian studies, you do see many Indians there. So we cannot straightforwardly say. But overall, it would be correct to say that it's a system of privilege that demands a level of intellectual ideological conformity. Points 2 and 3 are pretty straightforward, so I won't read them out. But the kind of knowledge that is now practiced in the humanities has nothing to do with self-knowledge. It has nothing to do with ethics. It's a kind of ethnographic or anthropological studying of the other that objectifies, demeans, and others cultures like India. And many Indians are justly troubled by the way the humanities have turned to look at India, not in a dialogue of equals, not in a philosophical conversation, but in some very problematic ways I will discuss. Finally, let's be clear about this. If science is universal, everyone can participate. And this has been shown time and again in fields like medicine or engineering, where there are simply no barriers to entry for Indians. I mean, they have proven again and again their skills. Academia is something else, especially the humanities. You will see the kind of discrimination and othering that goes on, and I'll share some examples of that. Does that exonerate all Indian scholars? Am I again placing this in terms of the West versus India, East versus West? No, because many Indian scholars also succumb to this narrative that the Western humanities were critical. The tradition was orthodox, the tradition was backward or regressive, the tradition was unwilling to exercise historical criticism or see historical differences. And so many Indian academics also thought we have to simply become Western. We have to, it's a kind of cosplay, a costume play where we simply adopt Western mores and attitudes. So this becomes a problem. And on the right, I have Iravati Karve, who's called the founder or the doyen of Indian anthropology. And she actually went to Germany, studied in an institute, Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft. It's a very problematic institute with a history of racism and Nazism. It doesn't exist anymore. But she got her PhD under one of the founders of German race science. And he taught her this science, this art and skill of measuring skulls. Brought back that science to India and anthropologized a lot of Indian texts. So her interpretation of the Mahabharata, the burning of the Khandava forest, is simply, oh, that must have been sugarcane fields, and it was the Aryans who came in and they burned down the fields, and the Nagas, who are mythological creatures, they must have been the Dravidians. So that kind of interpretation goes on. What had caused this? The Indian episteme would not have interpreted the text like this. There is a vast commentarial tradition in which it never occurred to anyone to place this conflict in the Mahabharata into the setting of a racial struggle. Even the concept of a race had probably not occurred to them. What caused Indians to give up and set aside their own extremely rich hermeneutics, extremely philosophical way of thinking, for this kind of cheap and naive historicism, non-participation. And that's why I decided from Western philosophy to return, to go back and participate and see how we could undo at an individual and personal level, which I'm sure many of you here are trying to do, undo the effects of colonization. Kalyan already mentioned this quote, so I won't read it out. That is the man on the left, Heinrich von Stiekenkron, being awarded the Distinguished Indologist Award. And he's making a very, very large claim, right? The claim is that the Indian interpreters are not objective. They all have religious prejudices. They're all trying to claim the text for themselves. But let's now go and ask some critical questions. One, are all Indian commentators uncritical as a group, as a genus, as a class? Are they all biased? Are they all unreliable? What is this new method that allegedly brackets out all religious prejudice, though injecting, there's a spelling mistake there, though injecting massive amounts of racist prejudice? Look at the claim he's making. They are biased because they each have their own religious system. Look at what he's doing in making that claim. He is equally biased, right? Do you all see that? He's not just equally biased, he's far more biased. Because while they might have had slight differences of interpretation, it never occurred to Shankaracharya, for example, to go to someone and say, you know, your entire, or let's do it the other way, since that would be chronologically more accurate. It never occurred to Ramanuja to go and say, Shankaracharya's interpretation doesn't count because he's from so-and-so background. He debated him on the merits. Whereas Stiekenkron is simply saying, qua Indian, qua their very approach, they are not to be engaged with. Because they take this text seriously, because they are embedded in a tradition, they are not to be engaged with. So there's a massive amount of racist prejudice here. And if you turn the question around and ask, have German Indologists not been guilty of misappropriation of text? Of course they have. From Hauer to Himmler, they have reappropriated the Bhagavad-Gita. The groundwork for this reappropriation was laid by scholars like Garba and Oldenburg. And we will come later on to slides that show the continuity of this motive. So let's pause there. Yes?
If you go back to the previous slide, imagine when you say, compared to Westerners, all Asians, or all Africans, or all Muslims, or all Jews, all African Americans. So you see how racist that statement is. And what is shocking is that we Indian scholars read this and it does not hit us in the face like a slap, right? If I, as an Indian person, read somebody say, all Jews are so-and-so, I would be shocked. And yet we as Indians have become desensitized to people just categorizing, stereotyping us, and we just accept it. We don't see it. Did Pranab Mukherjee not read this statement by Heinrich Stiekenkron, right? Why is it that it is just about okay to bag all Hindus into one uncritical group as if they were primitive, or as if they were so easy to, you know, one Indian, you know them all, right? This is shocking. This is absolutely shocking. More shocking than the statement is that many of us are not even shocked when we see Indian commentators are uncritical, Western scholars. We see, oh, there may be a problem, but we do not see it as an absolute racial stereotyping. Okay, continue.
And maybe, Vishwa, just one more thing. What is maybe even more shocking than that is Indians and Hindus like Pranab Mukherjee happily and willingly giving awards to Stiekenkron for the work that they've done, the critical work that they've done about the texts of India.
Right. So the problem is not just with knowledge, it is about a whole economical, political institutionalization. So Joy has more to say on that, I'm sure. So let's continue.
Okay, let's continue. So the course here, the feedback I got on my webinars from Kalyan, and it's the only feedback I had, was that I give these super self-contained talks, at which point everyone says, we've learned everything we need and we won't register for the course. So I was asked to sort of introduce it in a way that I don't give away the whole course. So I'm going to actually show you connections that will be made in the course. I will sort of adumbrate, outline them, but I won't make the full connections. And then there will be much more time for discussion. So the three connections that need to be made, that will be made in the upcoming courses: systems of classification set the basis for the concept of race. Man himself is degraded to an object within the natural kingdom. And just as you have you go from kingdom downwards, phylum, etc., you go down to species. A similar analogous classification was made of the human race from Homo sapiens into its subforms. And this is the actual origin of the concept of race. For a long time, it was thought that racism comes about, or the concept of race comes about, after slavery, and there's a need to justify slavery. Scholars have now revised that concept. They in fact see that the concept of race comes up much earlier. It comes up in the context of science, in the context of European scholars who are struggling with classifying the diversity of humankind prior to slavery. Of course, there's an application thereafter, and it is used to justify and legitimate, but the historical connections are now clear. So we have to go much further back. Comparative biology and anatomy shaped a discipline called comparative linguistics, and there were several layers used. First was skin color as the most obvious difference. Then they used the cranial measurements, measuring the skulls, the shape and size of skulls. Various criteria were postulated for making these absolute distinctions. And ultimately, a jump was made to language as the place where cultural superiority shows itself. So early on, aesthetic criteria of this is a more beautiful skull, I'll show you some images of that kind of judgment. Those were made, but ultimately certain languages were considered more refined, more cultured, more advanced, more sophisticated, and part of a common family, and its members were then also racially linked, and others were excluded from this linguistic system. Intelligence will be correlated with physiognomy. This is the discipline of anthropology, and very interestingly for us, it will be correlated with language. And this is where Indology as a kind of comparative linguistics oriented towards Sanskrit comes about. Note something very important, and I will never cease to stress this as long as I'm an HUA faculty member. The original target of this classification, this racial system, was not India. In fact, India stood very high in the esteem of the scholars. Asia as a whole stood very high in the esteem of the scholars who came up with the system. At that time, Europe had not sort of made its great leap forward over the rest of the world. And Asia was the home of the greatest, oldest civilizations. It was the home, sort of the biblical home. And so there was a need to appropriate that. And what happened in this system of classifying, of claiming an Indo-European connection, was actually the exclusion of Africa. Now, does it affect India as well? Yes, indirectly, because Black India also, that is Indian culture insofar as it cannot claim a European or an Aryan pedigree, is also excluded. If you want to see the latest and most striking example of how this racialist thinking continues today, take a look at Michael Witzel's book on the world's two mythologies. It's the most absurd and outrageous book ever published. And it shows how many knots people are willing to tie themselves up into to continue this two stocks thinking. The notion of two stocks of mankind, two separate groups of mankind, goes back to Schlegel, though it obviously has biblical roots older than that. All right, so where does the notion of race come from? This is a quote from a very good paper on nation and race. And I'm just going to read the essence of the quote. It is certain at least that no 18th century dictionary defined race in the modern sense of a subdivision of the human species, that is identified by a shared appearance and other inherited traits. Linnaeus, that is the man you see on the right, Carl von Linné, Swedish scientist whom we all know from his system of classification. Linnaeus, Buffon, Blumenbach, and other scholars converted the scattered misconceptions and antagonisms of traders and travelers into coherent systems. Before these authors, racism could exist as little more than a visceral distrust of physical difference, crudely expressed in degrading images and outbursts of disgust. Only with the rise of racial science could racism take the form of an objective and self-conscious conviction in the radical inferiority of certain visibly different groups. We won't in this course look at the taxonomic thing. The reason being that that would be an entirely new course or a second course you'd have to do, but that paper has been written. There is a wonderful scholar of language called E.F. Kerner, and all of his work I read and cited, and Vishwa and I put up this paper on academia where we fully explain these connections of how the taxonomic system was taken over into the study of language and then adopted by Indologists such as August Wilhelm Schlegel. So that paper is on academia. I'll put up the link and you can read that. What we will do in this course is start with this man on the left, Friedrich Schlegel, the elder brother of August Wilhelm Schlegel, and really the first person who gives an impetus to Indian studies, the study of Sanskrit in Germany. He borrows his ideas of classification from comparative anatomy. All this has been, by the way, worked out and demonstrated, so I'm just giving it to you in point form. He applies it then to languages, traces them back to a common origin. He biologizes this understanding, since linguistic affiliation, if your languages are shared, that means you come from a common stock. One language is divine in origin. At that point, he thought Sanskrit was this mother language, the origin of all human culture. And in a famous letter, he says, everything, absolutely everything comes from India, which many Indians cite on Twitter, and they never understand why they do it because they don't understand the background. The whole point is to exclude Black Africa from participation in intellect and this divine plan. The Africans, that's the last point on my slide here. The Africans have only imitative speech. They have gurgling animal cries. They're very much like apes. And whenever he was pointed out, right? So you see how racism works. Whenever it was pointed out, well, Egypt has a highly civilized culture and it's in Africa, guess what his response was? Anyone? Throw it out in chat if you want. I'll look at the chat for a minute. Okay, no guesses. So I'm going to give you the answer. When this was noted, they migrated. Who said they migrated? Partha, excellent. Indrani, not they were civilized. Egypt is an Indian colony. And its priestly structure shows the fact that a few Brahmins, just a handful of Brahmins came there and established the Egyptian civilization. So this is how absurd those theories of linguistic affiliation or common descent are. And one of my favorite I have lots of little sort of things to tease you with. By the way, he says in one of his books, he says, there is this book in India called Skondo Purano, because he learned Sanskrit from a Bengali. And he says, from which clearly the name Scandinavian must come. So if you didn't know that, Scandinavian comes from Skanda. So, you know, I mean, I can do pseudoscience with the best of them. I live in Germany. I'm excellent in doing it, Indology with the best of them. Okay, let's jump ahead. So this is the kind of system of taxonomy that was worked out. There was obviously an aesthetic ideal in the background. If you read August Schlegel, he wrote lectures on aesthetics where he speaks about the ugliness of the human skull. I don't have that quote on this slide because I used it on another presentation, but I have some equally offensive ones. So if it comes to offensive quotes, trust me, you know, the bookshelf behind me, that wall of books, practically 50% of it is offensive stuff written by Indologists. Okay, how does this system of racial and racist thought spread? The answers are pretty simple. Let's go through them quickly. Near total colonization of the world by Europe. If you want to see what that looks like, this is a map. Green is colonized or controlled by Europe. Light green is partial European control. Yellow is European sphere of influence. Orange is never colonized by Europe. Can anyone tell me the 3 countries never colonized by Europe? How good are you at reading your maps? Ankur, you're on mute. So it's Japan, Thailand, and the Koreas, or at that point, a united Korea. So yeah, who said Taiwan? Not Taiwan. Taiwan was actually, you can see is green. Now, why was Thailand orange? It wasn't directly colonized. Why was it not colonized? Guess what? It wasn't like the Thais were capable of standing up to the Europeans. On the left, you have British Burma, and on the right, you have French Indochine. And these two powers decided that to prevent them going at each other with hammer and tongs, they needed a buffer state. So they kept Thailand as a buffer state, but they reduced it by about 1/3 of its size. They carved off bits of it from the left and from the right and left a little bit. So really, and then Japan also, you can say that Commodore Perry came with his fleet and so on. So really, there is not a place in the world that has not in some way suffered or sort of been affected by European colonization. Who said Ethiopia was never colonized? That is incorrect. It was an Italian colony. Okay, let's now go back. Second point, Catholic popes legitimized the treatment of non-Christians as chattel. That means as goods that can be traded. So this kind of very crude objectification, reduction to material is being done. The replacement of traditional education from Macaulay to R.G. Bhandarkar. I find it very interesting that Bhandarkar is both the first product of the Macaulayan educational system, but also its greatest advocate. So he's sort of the Indian Macaulay for me. And at this point, the people at the Bhandarkar Oriental Institute in Pune are going to scream, but you know, it's nice that they're at least getting a little more articulate. Finally, point 4, a system of economic deprivation. So this is one of the papal bulls. There's a second one. This was sort of the division of the New World between Spain and Portugal so that those two would not fight. And I forget which pope gave the second bull, but these two bulls sort of divided the world and gave authority over all the possessions. A certain demeaning interpretation of the world, which is purely materialistic, purely oriented to ownership, possession, despoliation, comes to the fore with modernity. We all live with those consequences. And those consequences are becoming urgent, ever more urgent for us. It is simply unsustainable. And insofar as all of us sort of commit to a more ethical way of living, that is the best we can do. We can't sort of go out and change 200 years of history, but individually it is possible to contribute. So let's now turn to understanding where we are.
Go back to that slide. I want everybody to, this is still not recalled by the Pope. Bull, as in bulletin, is an official document which is given by the Pope. There are ex cathedra and ex pontifica. There are all these different levels of these declarations. But for the common person, the word of Pope is the word of God. And for a common Catholic. So here is the Pope saying that those who are not Christian are property of the Christians. Not just their land, not just their resources, but their lives, because they don't have a soul. Imagine that this is at the background of European colonization. They literally have the stamp, seal, and sword of God to authorize and legitimize exploitation. Okay. If Stetencron was, quote, critical, what has he written about this? What have the Indologists written about ethical responsibility? They throw around words like Black Lives Matter, global humanities, we need to reform, we need to take care of the environment, and we are so great, but look at other countries. They are bad, and so on. It's just unthinkable. It's just unthinkable. And today, we have one pope who still sort of accepts, that people who are divorced should be sort of forgiven. And he has not taken back this position. He has not apologized for this position. Continue.
So let's go now to part two. This was a very broad sketch of how we got here, taking you through how a certain view of man emerges. This is not man as endowed with reason, as completely distinct from the animal kingdom, but as subordinated to the same system of classification and the same logic as the animal kingdom. So just as you can have a genus and then you have species and subspecies based on significant morphological physiognomic distinctions, the same logic of phenotypes is applied to humans. So they were not seen in their individuality, their singularity, their distinctiveness, their capacity for rational thought, but in terms of these broad categorizations. And then that was taken over in a project of applying it to languages and cultures, and a taxonomic scheme was applied to cultures as well. It is that taxonomic scheme that gives Steven-Kron's statement force. Without that in the background, and all of you, whether you are academics or not, whether you're Indian or Western, all of us implicitly share that background because we have all experienced these 200 years of history. That makes Steven-Kron's statement appear intelligible, right? No one here said, wait a minute, stop the presentation. I don't understand what he's saying. What Indians? How are you classifying these people? There's like 1.2 billion Indians, and an Indian commentator who lived in 1600 is not the same as an Indian who lived in 1800 or in the 8th century. So that statement should be unintelligible. It is logically, it makes no sense. And yet there is an epistemic system behind that, grounding the notion that there is something called the European and the Indian, and all Indians are the same, either by virtue of participation in a culture or a religion or a language. But that kind of distinction actually now makes sense to us. We might be offended by the racism of what he said, or some of us might go and tweet about it and say, this guy is so, stupid, etc., etc. But to question the very fact that that statement somehow makes sense to us, that is the goal of this course. Okay, so this is now a kind of teaser that tantalizes a portion of what we're going to be reading in this course. So I took some of these very ugly 19th century men who said all sorts of absurd things in German, and I translated a few of the most shocking and horrific ones. And I'm just going to run through them and sort of not give away the whole course, but tell you what kinds of explanations of Indian text we're going to read. Can anyone guess what text is being explained here? Type it into chat. I want to see if you recognize the Indian text he's explaining. Anyone guess? Ramayana, very good. Lots of Ramayanas. Yes, excellent. So this interpretation of the Ramayana, right, which had not occurred to anyone to say that the Vanaras must be certain people, he comes up with this explanation. So when the Aryans came into India, they met this culture, which was so ugly that they could only be represented as apes. And this was not meant to be a flattering comparison because of the remarkable ugliness, etc., etc. Now, what is the problem with this explanation? Let's go back and see where that aesthetic judgment is coming from. Sorry, now I went too fast. This is where the aesthetic judgment is coming from. So he's guilty of a fallacy of projecting his aesthetic values and systems back onto ancient India and saying that these people who were described as apes could only have been very ugly, negroid looking peoples. Let's go to a next one. So not only are certain peoples explained as being aboriginal or negroid or ape-like, but also the Aryans have come into India and given their language to these people. So there resound dialects of Aryan origin in the mouths of mixed races and even in the mouths of completely non-Aryan tribes. But this linguistic transfer does not fully ennoble the people in India. These mulattoes is an offensive term for someone of mixed race. These mulattoes have alienated themselves not only linguistically, but also intellectually and ethically from the ancient Aryan nature. So the purity of Aryan culture, the purity of that intellect was handed down only through blood. And woe betide you if your father, being Aryan, slept with a darker woman, you know. You would turn out this mixed product, you would be degenerate, you would not only look physically different, but you would have ethically and intellectually fallen from the high Aryan standards. Says the man who is spouting the most absurd racist nonsense. And you want to ask him, hey, where are your high Aryan standards? And where were the high Aryan standards of all of German Indology? And where were your high Aryan standards you were appealing to during the Holocaust? You know, I mean, the absurdity of this epistemic beggars belief. All right, let's continue with one more. The gods of Hinduism are the misshapen, wild, cruel, lascivious Hindu gods at their head, Shiva and Vishnu. A transformation that affects the innermost core of the people's soul. Mixing with the dark-skinned aboriginals changes the invaders, turns the Aryans into Hindus. So aren't you happy you took this course? Now you know who you are, right? That's what the Hindu University of America has done. It has finally clarified for you how you became Hindu. Forget these absurd explanations. These historicists, geneticists explanations reveal the insecurity of these men and their lack of a credible way of approaching or interpreting text. They simply have no qualification for interpreting text. Okay, this continues up until 1950s, 1970s. This is Paul Hacker, the Indologist. By the way, if you wanted names, I will go back and tell you. This is Hermann Oldenburg, this is Richard Garber, and this is Albrecht Weber. So I have their names and dates at my fingertips, but I didn't want to clutter the slide. In Neo-Hinduism, the continuity with the past is broken. So remember, Oldenburg already said there was a break. There is Aryan and there's Hindu. And there's a break there because the racial continuity has been broken. And remember, Garber said, and not only is it broken, but you've fallen away from the Aryan ethical standards, those wonderful high Aryan ethical standards. Now comes Hacker and says, in Neo-Hinduism, the continuity with the past is broken. The typical Neo-Hindu has lost his confidence in his native religion. Typical Neo-Hindus have received the ideas of religious, ethical, social, and political values, not from their native religion, but from Western philosophies or from Christianity. I don't know what to say. I mean, the idea that, you know, in today's globalizing world, this was, of course, 1970s or so, or he wrote this 1952, I think. It's still difficult to swallow, because the kind of racism and the kind of hatred that Indology has been propagating, the kind of divisive thinking, the kind of refusal to colonize tradition. Let's take as an example, just as an example, you know the festival of Kwanzaa, which was created to give African Americans an alternative to sort of, you know, put them back in touch with their roots. My friend Ed Butler is here. I'm sure he could say more about that. Imagine someone going and mocking African Americans and saying, what you're doing is ersatz. You're trying to pick up a tradition, but actually you're not. You're nothing but the children of slaves. You're nothing but the inferior children, and using racial slurs on them. It would be unacceptable. Yes, there was a break due to colonization. Yes, many Hindus, for example, many of our students come back and want to learn something about traditions that were not given to them as children, that they now want to re-engage with. Everyone has that right of self-discovery. If you wanted to do Kung Fu and go learn Kung Fu or become a Japanese sushi chef, I would support you. You have the same freedom to say, I want to go back and learn some Shastras. You have that freedom. And that's what the HUA is there for, to to answer that need and to fulfill that responsibility. And this is the opposite of HUA, this Nazi monster on the left, trying to deny a colored people their right to reestablish continuity with their ancestors, and instead trying to shepherd them in the direction of Christianity. So here's another one. This is Walter Slyer, teaches at Halle. And he says, such a far-reaching reception of Occidental values, ideas, and patterns of thought led India in the secular domains of education, state, and administration, ultimately, and in comparison to the pre-colonial epoch, become a Europe in Indian costume. Something that can, against the background of the blah, 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 also be asserted for other non-European cultures in the present. Now he's accepting traditional Hindu religion from it. So all the institutions, the constitution, etc., are European or Western. I think many of us would agree with that statement, but we are not Europeans in Indian costume. If anything, it is the other way around. We are Indians in European costume. Take a look around you, and you will see in Silicon Valley, what they have adapted to is the technology, the modes of dress, the language, the cars, but the value system is ultimately not European. And that is what gets their goat, because the whole project of colonization was not to give the blacks technology and iPhones, but to make sure that they were aware of their cultural inferiority. And instead, the opposite happened. Instead of accepting the humanities in this inhuman form, what has become global is technology and the sciences. And what remains parochial and European and racist and nasty are the humanities. I was watching an AR panel about 4 days back, and this person was doing ethnographic research of a certain community in India. And one of the things she mentioned in her slide is that although they claim to be religious and so on, they want all the trappings of success and wealth, and using Apple products and having Macs at home is very important for them. At that point, I really wanted to smile and said, this obviously bothers her. Because when Indians and Chinese are starting to use Macs, what makes you unique? You can point your camera as much as you like at these families and photograph them. The Alleinstellungsmerkmal, the distinctive attribute, has been lost. Let's continue.
If I may interrupt, if you go back to the previous slide or whichever you were doing, this slide, this is European exclusivism, right? He's an apologist for European superiority, exclusivism, and triumphalism. This is an age-old anxiety. Already in Shakespeare, this anxiety breaks out onto the stage in the play Tempest, in which Prospero is lost on an island and he gives language to Caliban, who is this sort of half-human creature, a monster on this island. And then Caliban says, with the language you've taught me and enslaved me, I now curse you back. So this anxiety was always a part of this European thing. And so the European Indologist is always struggling with this anxiety that the natives might revert back to Shankara and their ancestors and discount the superiority of European culture, either by rejecting it, or if they accept it, they would accept it without also accepting European hegemony. That's the anxiety here.
Okay, let me continue now. Thank you. So we are back to Paul Hacker, who made no secret of his interest in Christianity. All his interpretations were tendentious in every way possible. For example, with the neo-Hinduism thesis, by saying, oh, you cannot engage with modern day Indians who are speaking for Hinduism because they're neo-Hindus, they don't know the tradition. As an Indologist, I have direct access to the past, only I know what Hinduism is, etc., etc. All these different ways, tendentious ways he read texts, his alleged philology, he was a very bad scholar, very bad philologist, did not know textual criticism. So he would read these texts in this problematic way. And at the end of his life, he sort of came out openly and said, look, I wanted to place my science in the service of the church. And above, he says, my real profession is the science of India. This science of India, Indology, is what Vishwa and I have been interrogating for the last 10, 15 years. What is scientific about this science? What does it consist in? And how is it that only Westerners are participants in this science, or Indians can only be participants if they sort of accept these claims and go along with statements that, oh, you're neo-Hindu, oh, you're inauthentic, etc., etc. Okay, Harker. So let's talk about Paul Harker. Since we've been taught the historical critical method, and now we're all neo-Hindus and we're very articulate in English and we're capable of talking back, let's talk back. Paul Harker was a Nazi and SS member. His methods are unscientific and tendentious. He is motivated by evangelism. He twists logic and facts to refuse Hindus any ethical consciousness or self-knowledge. But even today, Indologists will defend him, claiming he is more authoritative on the Upanishads than even Shankaracharya. So Shankaracharya, as you saw from Stephen Kran's quote, cannot be trusted. He's a native commentator. But Harker trained in Western critical methods, historical critical methods. He is the authority on Shankara. Never mind the fact that he's blowing smoke up everyone's ass because he's trying to defend some strange vision of Christianity. That does not make his hermeneutics in any way religious. That makes them objective. But if you were a Vaishnava,
yeah, the same Indologists who hold Paul Harker as the first step in studying the Brahma Sutra or the Bhashyas of Shankaracharya, an authority over Shankaracharya, the same Indologists are today hell-bent on showing that there's no such thing as Hinduism, there's only Hindutva. So the ironies of this situation are deeply concerning for all humanities. Who in a university would, today's university, if this happened in, let's say, Greek or Latin studies, or if this happened in Spanish studies, this happened in philosophy, those persons will be shut down. But in Indology, apparently it is okay to support the bad philology of a Nazi, but even Joy and I are now considered, quote, Hindutva. This is absolutely ridiculous, right? So you see that Indology represents how humanities in general have a problem, but Indology is the sort of the canary in the coal mines. It is telling us what is deeply wrong with humanities at the university today.
And that claim that if you refuse the science of this Nazi Harker, you're somehow Hindutva is like saying a Jew who refuses to accept Nazi hegemony is automatically a Zionist. It's a false argument. It just does not hold. No one has to submit. No one with an ethical consciousness needs to subject to or accept Nazism as normative. And to set up this false dichotomy to say either you go with Harker and you overlook all the terrible things he did and said, and you accept, you sort of join us in concealing his Christian evangelism and say, oh, it's all science, or we'll call you Hindutva. This is absurd. And Vish and I will publicly call out everyone who does it and invite them to hurl this charge at us, because it is only when they hurl it 1,000 times and it does not have an effect that charge will ultimately be negated, not just for Vishwa and me, but for anyone else who says, you do not define me. So taking away their privilege of naming things, as you saw, what the Pope had granted was also a privilege to name things in the New World. That ancient hegemony of Europeans to give things a name, which goes from the Pope into the classification of linears, into the systems of taxonomy adopted to cultures. That is what we are challenging through this intellectual enterprise. Okay, now one of the factors, if you remember on that 4-point slide I had put, was economic deprivation. It's something I didn't have pictures or images for. I don't want to get into it. I'm not an economist, but you must understand that underlying it is, of course, a system of economic supremacy and privilege. And I have a quote for you from Hacker on the right, who said that we can currently only donate through personal contacts because the donations given to the mission by American and European Catholics are actually supporting progressivism and the fall into heathenism and semi-heathenism, but not the devoted Catholics. So I put just one quote. There are several other quotes from him. There's another one where he says, the missions in India are doing charitable work, caritative Arbeit, and they're giving medicine and food and clothes, but they're not insisting on conversion. So we should not call this mission if they are not doing what they're really supposed to do. And then one of the readers of his articles writes back and says, oh, let's stop all donations to India and let them go hungry, and soon they will see who the paymasters are. So this is the level to which they were willing to go, to deny miserable, sick, starving Indians food or clothing or medicine. Why? So that they would accept the grace of Christ? Don't make me laugh. Hacker couldn't give a damn about Christ because they would not accept European superiority. This was always and only about race for him. So Christianity itself, although Christianity fosters race in a certain way, as we saw, Christianity itself now only survives in the humanities as a form of race play, because nothing these people do could be equated with the message of Christ. All right. So what do we do now? This is the shortest part of my presentation, and we're getting soon into the discussion. We have a challenge. I've not given you a whole course this time, or rather a whole seminar, as I was told I used to do in the past. I've given you a teaser of the problem and the enormous challenges we face. What should we do now? How do we rebuild our traditions? For me, the answer came with Vishwa, from whom I started studying Indian philosophy and the Mahabharata. You all know his biography on the right, but I simply put up this image, which I like a lot. It was taken in summer outside his house in New Jersey. And it's not a question of opposing East to West. Neither of us are ignorant of the West. We've both studied Western philosophy. We're completely at home in German intellectual history. This is not about saying Indologists are bad if they're Western. This is not about saying white people cannot read Indian texts or cannot do yoga. All my yoga teachers, by the way, have been white. I would never have done yoga if it had not been for some very good yoga studios around my home here. The point is, the humanities as they've been practiced, and most notably in Indology, have neither led to self-knowledge nor fostered understanding. They have been a form of race play. And for the sake of that petty consciousness of themselves as European and superior, which you saw all those quotes, these men have sacrificed the goal of life, which is knowledge. Not only have they misled Indians, they wasted their own lives. Because this kind of race play, it's jejune and petty, and most people get over it. But to devote an entire academic career to these distinctions of the Indians are like this, but I'm like this, the Indians don't accept me, the Indians are, I'm sorry, my dog is getting restless and tugging at the cable to my computer. So he's a very clever dog. Okay, let me go one further. So these are the books that Vishwa and I wrote. I won't speak about HU as an institution that has built up a space for this kind of work, because all of you have visited their website, have attended the seminar, know something about HU. It is a huge, huge step in the humanities. Vishwa and I would not associate with the institution if we did not really and truly believe that it gives an opportunity to question and to critique some of the established dogmas in academia today. Let me end with the Bhagavad-Gita, which all of you know. Ultimately, the reason you need to take this course is not for me or for Vishwa or for HU, it is for yourselves. Because the ability to unpack a kind of history under which many Indians suffer, and a kind of prejudice that has seeped into our skins. There's a black writer of negritude I'm very fond of, called Fanon, who says, the inferiority is in the first step economic, but then there is an interiorization, or even better, an epidermalization of this inferiority. So it seeps into your skin. And the only way to seep it out, to sort of extract it out, is through this kind of historical critical work, going back and unpacking the layers of why you feel pain today, why you feel disadvantaged, why people like Stephen Crown can make statements like this, and you feel something about it. You feel angry maybe, but you don't know how to respond. And the response is not just to shout something offensive at him, but to say, explain your statement to me. It doesn't make sense to me. What do you mean by Indians? What do you mean by Europeans? How are you making these broad categorizations? What is the source of your categorical thinking? These kinds of questions, they are not placed to answer because they have not thought it out themselves. They're simply trading on old narratives of superiority. Vishwa wants to say something, so I'll hand it over to him.
Yeah, this verse means a lot to me, and thank you, Joy, for sharing this. Let me read it. Yasya sarve samarambha kama sankalpa varjitaha jnanagni dagdha karmanam tamahu panditam buddhaha. So this jnanagni dagdha karmanam, what is the karma here? The effects of history. I understand the context here is personal karma of the jiva, but the jiva is not separated from society, i.e. loka. So when there is this karma of let's say othering or racism or materialism or so, the point is not to get angry or further distort our peace and our knowledge and turn into our animality, if I may, but to learn the right thing. And it is that knowledge which will burn the karmas, right? It is not, somebody had written, Audrey Trushka in the chat, what can she do? She is just sailing on the effects of this historical advantaging of institutional power over these texts or over other cultures. A lot of Catholics have left the academy. They became Jesuits and very early on. Jews have their own yeshivas and so on. The Islamic students are learning very well from good madrasas. So it is time for us also to burn down this karma, this history that has in which we are entrapped by learning. And that learning is enshrined into the motto of Hindu University of America. Does anyone know the origin of Savidyaya Vimuktaye? Anyone? In chat? It comes from Vishnu Purana. Prahlada is sitting on Hiranyakashipu's lap, and Hiranyakashipu asks, what have you learned? Have you learned politics? Have you learned how to take care of your social advantage and position? Have you learned how to keep forest dwelling and other tribes under control? And Prahlada says, no. That is a tedious waste of my time, Father. I have learned about the eternal Brahman in the form of Vishnu. And he says, that is karma which does not bind. That is the good karma that does not bind. And that is knowledge which sets us free, which liberates us. So on that note, it is Prahlada's quote to Hiranyakashipu, Savidyaya Vimuktaye. Okay, so discussion, questions for Joydeep?
Yes, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to put up a poll real quick. See who is interested in taking this course. Please fill it out. Are you interested in enrolling in Race and Modern Hinduism with Dr. Joydeep Bakshi next quarter? I'm interested, but we also have Orientation to Hindu Studies. This is such a high-level course that we got into. If you haven't considered taking that, please do. We'll start taking questions now. So in the Q&A box, if you want to type it in there, it's easier for us than the chat because the chat scrolls. And also in the chat, I'm dropping, please enroll in Race and Modern Hinduism. There's a link. You can click there, see the exact time. You can enroll right there, read a little bit more, but obviously you have Dr. Bakshi right here answering your questions. So let's take your questions. We have something from Parthaji. In our reading material, there was a mention of anxiety about pantheism that influenced German acceptance of the Upanishads. Would you please elaborate on that? I guess I don't understand pantheism and its connection to the Upanishads. Kalanji, if you want to just, before contextualize, we have a bunch of orientation to Hindu studies students in this webinar right now, right?
Yeah, that's true. So there are a number of people who are currently in the orientation to Hindu studies course who are also listening in. And I want to thank everybody from the course who are joining in today. And I just want to mention that, see, the work that Vishwa and Joydeep have done is remarkable for the following reason. You know, they really excavated the genealogy of many of the ideas from European history that were written not in the English language. They were written in the German, in the original German language. And therefore, when they remain untranslated, you see, they're inaccessible to most Hindus. And, you know, I think a lot of the work Vishwa and Joydeep have done has been meticulously translating some of these German works and tracing the genealogy of these writings in terms of the tradition, the particular tradition of writing that got established, eventually resulting in the Holocaust. So they're doing a pretty phenomenal job on this. Joydeep and Vishwa, you want to comment on that in terms of what I just mentioned?
Jai?
Yeah, we have been doing this work. It has been long and arduous work. I remember right at the beginning when no one even knew we were doing this work, I would be trekking through the snow to archives and copying all this toxic, hate-filled literature. You know, and I would read it and I would translate it and I would talk to Vishwa about it and he would write about it and we would have this dialogue going on. And it was incredibly painful. If you get upset by the little rantings of a little somebody or the other who happens to teach at one of the less significant Rutgers campuses in New Jersey, who imagine how painful it is to go wait through 200 years of this kind of Orientalist thing.
So,
and directly, Vishwa was told he already had his first PhD. He had written a fantastic dissertation on Parmenides. He had read all of pre-Socratic philosophy. He was well known at classics conferences. He was told that he was an Indian and his approach to the Mahabharata was traditional Indian religious, etc. So directly students in Germany experience this kind of racism. And most of them are quiet about it and go away. Kalyan wanted to study Sanskrit at Harvard, and he was told that he had to first learn German because all the great work has been done by Germans and only the Germans have critical scholarship on the Vedas. HU is a response to that to say, we don't need to go through this ritual of fire, this little mini Holocaust that you are performing. We will not participate in it anymore.
And it's not that they have done this just to Indians, right? They've done it to Christianity, they've done it to Judaism, they've done it to Islam. The whole world is now armed with an identity battle and ideas have disappeared. This is tragic. We need to, like, you know, go beyond identities and try to look at ideas and accept human beings as different and yet not superior or inferior, or use this idiotic scale of monkeys to white Europeans and classify all human beings on that scale. Even if that classification were done accurately, what hope would it have for, forget spiritual progress, even for the global markets? That would be counterproductive, right? Even for materialism, it has become. So we've like gone beyond even just plain what is good for us materially, right? COVID vaccines are probably good for us, but the identity battles prevent even that. So humanities have done a bad job of setting people against people with this constant poking of the differences between people. And this is not humanities. This is not, the word human has to be removed from these humanities. Whatever they're doing, it's not humanities.
Let me answer a question I see asked by Srinivas. Srinivas asks, in the late 15th century, Europeans were in poverty and trying to compete in finding trade routes to India. Did the feeling of racial superiority come later when they gained economic and political superiority? Yes, very much so. In the time of Schlegel, there's this battle. I actually did a conference in Hyderabad where there was this whole discussion of were the Aryans out of India or into India? Did they migrate into or out of India? Guess who the original proponent of the out of India theory is? It's not an Indian, it's Schlegel. And what the German scholars today find so absurd and accuse Indians of nationalism for propounding, Schlegel was also propounding it for nationalistic reasons, except he was trying to rub off some of the glory of India by saying the Aryans, or he called them the Asiatic stock. The Asiatic stock came from India and they came to Europe, and guess what? They didn't come to all of Europe. France and Italy, not them. But up here in the north, they came and they established high culture, and partly in Scandinavia, but here in Germany, right by my bedside, is where they stopped and took a leak. So yes, there is a reversal in the flow of migration depending upon these external considerations. We all hold on to the notion that Aryans migrated into India as sort of scientific fact, but let's not forget that these facts are mutable. They are changeable because they answer to issues of privilege and power. And, who knows, in time, China may have established so many institutes of Indology that it will swing the Aryans around to Shanghai and say they came from Beijing or Shanghai. It won't be any more absurd than what Germans did for 200 years.
I want to pick up one question from the chat window. This is from Richa Gautam. I'm wondering if this course would address the caste and race conflation that is currently ongoing under the aegis of Equality Labs and Oprah and the newly developed mainstreaming of caste in the US. Could you also address this now, briefly?
So this is not the theme of the course. We won't be getting into caste. We're tracing a very specific European genealogy. And I actually find it very disruptive and disturbing to make these comparisons and say, well, other cultures had discrimination also, right? So when we're talking about the extermination of the Native Americans or the first Americans, which is one of the greatest genocides in history, you can't look at them and said, well, they also used to, fight amongst each other and kill each other. And they also had notions of their tribe being superior than other tribes. That is simply an invalid comparison. My speciality, my focus here is on telling a certain story that is the fate of European modernity, that is now the global fate. And going back 2000 years and saying 2000 years ago, every culture had its own problems and so on, does not help us address what we're facing today. So
yeah,
that's all I have to say.
but taking this course helps you understand the Western reception of this issue of caste, right? For example, all the Germans were interested in what they saw as Brahmanism, as the early Brahmins were the Aryans, right? And then this caste was used as a sotto voce communication, and until very recently, the idea of caste was important for the sake of conversion. So you would magnify the effects of caste to provide, quote, deliverance for the, quote, oppressed. And I'm not using the quotes as a to say that there are no oppressed people or there are no marginals in any society, but the thematization of it as caste first served the purpose of conversion, and next, when Indology came to this point today, where after India's independence, it became obvious that the Western sphere of influence or direct political hegemony over India has ended, Many people feel that modern India is too primitive and that the hegemony must be continued by offering a continuous critique of whatever the story Indians wish to tell of themselves. And caste has remained a very useful tool for such an analysis. If Oprah is listening, this is my message to her girlfriend, you're Black. Okay, so you know, reading about the caste is maybe helps you feel a little white, but you're Black. Okay, so having said that,
here is one more question
Mhm.
from Prabhat Tekriwal. What should be the actual goal from now on? The search for humanism or the uniformization, if that's a word, evolving to be one human race after unwrapping the true history and intentions? Of course, what should be our goal now?
Our
So the
goal
goal
is
is,
to learn to work with logic, learn to become critical of all prejudices, learn to accept difference without classifying it and essentializing differences, and continually struggle with compassion to find something to love in everything. But first and foremost, logic, because ideas are based on logic. We should stop this anthropological, ethnographic history, stop spinning out histories. If in the Middle Ages, all the countries that are there now today forgot all their history, tomorrow there will be peace in that region. We do not understand how violent, how uh, how deterministic history is. And if we do not emancipate ourselves from historicizing thinking, classificatory thinking, we are just material substances. That's all. So the future of humanity should be that, to say, hey, we are human, right? And whatever Shankara says, whether it is true or not, it is not true because he's an Indian. It is true because he may have logic and he may not have logic. And even in India, Stephen Cron, are you listening? No, he can't. He's dead. I'm sorry. So is he dead, Stephen Cron?
yes, he's dead by
Okay.
2018.
Okay, so that's what I kind of thought. Okay, so even Shankara had people like Ramanuja or Madhva disagreeing with him, but these disagreements were not, as Joy pointed out, cast in the model of current humanities. It is not like Shankara was a Keralite Brahmin and, Ramanuja is from a different region.
If I give my answer and a very short one to that question, what is the goal today? Rediscover your jivahood and rediscover the jivahood of other jivas and relate as a jiva to a jiva, not as a European to an Indian, right? So the abandonment of these identities, the realization of one's singularity, the pursuit of self-knowledge. Who am I? If Haka had gone with this pseudoscientific nonsense to an Indian guru, he would have said, who are you? Who is being justified here? Who is feeling validated? These are the questions to ask. And Haka would not have had an answer to them.
Wow, this is such an amazing conversation. We still have a lot of questions. We're at 10:20. Let's take about another 10 minutes and keep this going. It seems like you're familiar with the chat and the Q&A. If there's anything that jumps out at you that you want to address.
Let me check the Q&A again. Someone asks, the scale of the problem is so vast. How do we as individuals react and respond? Educate yourselves. You cannot change all of humanity, and people have karmas. I mean, I'm not here to preach this. This is the difference between Christianity and Hinduism for me, is that I'm not here to preach to Walter Sly and convert him to being a better human being according to my definition of better. He has his karmas, he has his view of the world, he can do what he wants. But individually, I can say, no, that's not the kind of scholarship I want. That's not the kind of human being I want to emulate. So you chart your own course, you take your courses at HUA and you learn. Other questions?
I have a comment. This material is a little bit disturbing because we don't like all this racism thing, but unless you've confronted, believe me, you will never have the self-satisfaction of simply being who you are without having to apologize to every tweet by or respond angrily to every tweet by the internet trollers like Trushka. So each of us has a soul. All human beings have a soul. All human beings have an intellect. So whether you're planning on taking many courses or a few courses, because Joy is teaching and he's my student, and I myself take his courses. Whatever he teaches, I sit in his course. So take it, because he makes it pretty easy for you to get to know the sources and so on. And once you see where things are coming from, you might even come to a point where you have compassion for people like Trushka and just smile and say, oh, okay, you have some problems. Maybe you should go back to school. I want all of you to use knowledge to better yourselves as humans and not give in to this internal struggle, right? So maybe if you take this course, you might not take all the courses, but when your kids come to you, or when someone comes to you and argues about, these things, at least you will have some names to throw at them. At least you'll have some concepts, a conceptual vocabulary in which to frame the question the right way, right?
There's one question I'd like to answer from Ravi Khanna. What role can Vedantic teachers, Swamis, play in this? Let me tell you a story. About 10 years back, I met a great guru, but he was a very mischievous guru. And we were having this conversation, and he said, what would you say to someone if he called you a fat American? And I was a young hothead, and I immediately said, I would say, F you, etc., etc. And he looked at me and smiled and said, you are a fool. You're not even American, right? So the story has a point to it, because the kind of objectifying humanities we've been doing, it will get no purchase on you if you yourself immerse yourself in this Vedantic worldview, right? So Trushka is baiting you on your identity as Indian. And if you went to a Vedantic guru and complained and said, she said this about all Indians, he would smile and say, you're a fool. You're not even Indian. You are nothing but the Atman, shining and pure. So they are all trading. This is what I try to bring about in the Stetenkron thing. That comment is trading not on something he said. That man has strung together words that have meaning because of 200 years or 300 years of what has happened in intellectual history. He is not himself self-conscious. I would not treat him as a person, because he lacks that intuitive cognitive component that I require. And so also, the things Trushka or whoever's bothering you currently is doing is simply trading. I mean, you already have raw skin and she knows it. And her greatness, her academic greatness, consists in pouring vinegar into people's wounds. I mean, and I'm using that motive consciously, because that's what they did to Christ on the cross. So please never come up and say Trushka is Christian, because she's doing the opposite of what, or she's doing exactly what was done to Christ. It's horrific.
So a couple of people, interesting, all very good. A couple of people asked about Aryanism and Indology, right? That's another course you taught. That's obviously not what this course is about. Maybe you can contextualize what you covered and kind of answer that question as part of this. Or
that is a question for Kalyan. It's actually a technical question. Kalyan works with Hindu University, he sees how many people are interested in stuff and he organizes the offerings. So we just did a course called the Nay Science, which was on the Nay Science, which was this course on Aryanism. I do not know when Kalyan will re-offer that course. So depending upon the need, but again, every course is self-standing. So if you take one course, it will actually help whenever that course is re-offered. You can take that as well.
So, I mean, I'm going to interpret that question in the following sense. How is this course substantially different than the Aryanism and Indology course? Can you say a couple sentences about that, Vishwaji or Joydeep?
Yeah, so the Aryanism and Indology kind of laid the groundwork for this course because it was a very detailed reading of the Nay Science. Now we're going a step further and looking at the larger movement of racism. So although racism was one of the topics covered in Nay Science, it's not really a book like Said's Orientalism. It's really a book on methods and how you study texts. And in the background, of course, because these people were racist, racism is in the background. Now we're going back and tracing the genealogy of racism, and specifically as it applies to India, because of course racism is a big topic. As I mentioned, in all these conversations, you will notice all these debates about did Aryans come from east or west, north or south, were they first Indian and then European, vice versa. You always have to ask the question, who is missing? Who is being excluded? That's the key we're going to use to read these texts. And again, the people excluding are going to be the Africans. And the horror that Indians face, the horror of being that confronts them, is being shoved into that category of African, because African equals non-being. And that I brought up Witzel's book in the beginning, it's still playing on that horror of certain people of being shoved into that category of people who have no culture, no civilization, no language, no right to exist. More questions?
Well, we're almost at the top of the hour.
Yeah.
I know that there are many comments and questions that probably we won't get to today, but I want to leave you all with a couple quick things. The first is, the careful excavation of European thought of over 200, 300 years from a Indic or a Hindu perspective has not really happened substantially. We've caught glimpses of it here and there. A few authors have broken out and have written a few things. But Vishwa and Joydeep are making a very important beginning here, and there's a scope for all of us to participate in this and understand not only the genealogy but all the different branches and different ways in which these European ideas have seeped into the contemporary humanities. And I mean, there is also this whole question of where does the humanities go in the future? If all that it does is turn one group of people against another group of people, and that's its whole reason for existence. If that's not what it is, then what is the humanities, right? So it's a very, very important question, and it's not only relevant for the Hindus, but for all human beings, really speaking, because turning one people against another people is happening right now in an extraordinarily intense manner. Just how you draw the line is all that matters at the end of the day, right? Where you distinguish the two groups, this us versus them. You draw a line somewhere, and then the two become enemies immediately. Now, the last thing I want to say is, for people who have not yet taken the Orientation to Hindu Studies course, please start your journey there. That's a great place to begin. And then there's all these fantastic courses available at HUA, and you can take it at your own pace and move through the curriculum. So with that, we're at 12:30 my CS Central Time. I'd like to conclude this webinar and thank you to all of you for participating. Thank you, Joydeep from Germany, and Vishwaji from New Jersey. So thank you all. Namaste.
Thank you all. Namaste.